In the year of our Lord 1530, when the air over London still smelled of river rot and smoke, and the bell of St. Mary's tolled heavy with the weight of prayer and plague, there lived a man named Richard Roose, of no high station, no royal blood, no noble deed to his name. He was but a cook, and not even a master of his craft, though his stews were thick and his meats well brown. Rose served within the kitchens of Lambeth Palace, that ancient seat of bishops and godly men, whose stone walls had seen the prayers of saints and the sins of kings. Beneath those vaulted arches where choirs once sang, and scrolls of Latin lay in perfumed ink, Rose labored with cleaver and ladle, his hands scorched red from the fire, his tunic stained with mutton grease. He was a quiet man, though not without wit. Those who knew him spoke of a crooked grin that played often at the corners of his mouth, and eyes that watched more than they ought. Some said he once served a minor lord in Wiltshire, others that he had taken to wandering after a brief spell in Newgate prison, but no one knew for certain. In London, as in all great cities, men became ghosts of themselves, shadows clinging to service for bread and shelter. The court of King Henry was not yet ablaze with heresy, but the wind had begun to shift. The Queen, Catherine of Aragon, had grown weary with the king's affections. Whispers of Anne Boleyn drifted through tapestries and hallways like smoke from a smothered candle. And in the alleys, reformers murmured of Bibles in English and the Pope's dwindling hold. Yet none of this troubled Roose. His was a world of broth and barley, of salt beef and onions, of the slow turning of a spit. And so it was, on a cold morning in early March, when frost still clung to the latticed windows, that Richard Roose awoke, drew his threadbare cloak about him, and went to prepare a pot of soup that would alter the course of his life, and perhaps the very kingdom itself. He did not know it then. He could not have. No man stirs a pot thinking it will be his grave. The broth simmered gently in the iron pot, a dull gurgle rising with each bubble that burst upon the surface. Fat floated in pale ribbons atop the stew. Beef marrow, leeks, barley, a touch of sage. Roose moved quietly about the kitchen, stirring with a long-handled wooden spoon, tasting with the tip of his finger. The kitchen boys joked in low voices behind him, scraping trenchers and cracking eggs, the scent of burning charcoal thick in the air. The dish was meant for the household of the Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher, a man of holy reputation and an enemy to the winds of change now rustling through England. It was a Lenten meal, modest and meatless, intended for the bishop's table and for the students he tutored in his private chambers. The cook worked without fear or suspicion, humming under his breath the refrain of an old Yorkshire ballad. The morning passed as many before it had, with the clatter of pots, the sharp bark of the steward, and the flickering glow of firelight. The stew was served at the noon hour. Within the stone hall of the bishop's lodging, under a timbered ceiling soot-blackened by years of candle smoke, the bowls were placed with care upon the long oak table. The bishop himself had not yet come, delayed by prayers or counsel, but his household dined in his stead. A young gentleman named Bennet, barely more than a boy, took the first bite, followed by a clerk, then two of the bishop's servants. They ate in the manner of the pious, slow, respectful, heads bent over the bowl. The first to fall was Bennet. He cried out with a sound not unlike the yelp of a dog struck by cartwheel, clutching at his throat, then collapsed face first into his trencher. His lips turned black in moments. The clerk followed, gasping and retching, his chair toppling backward with a sharp clatter that silenced the room. Panic spread like wildfire. One man staggered toward the door before he too dropped to the ground, convulsing. Cries rang through the palace. "Poison! They are poisoned!" Servants fled in terror. The steward bellowed for aid. A physician was summoned from across the Thames, but it was too late for one, and the others lay writhing with twisted limbs and darkened skin. The bishop, spared only by lateness, arrived to see death already at his door. The pot was seized. The remaining broth was thick, steaming still, innocent to the eye, but cursed. The kitchen was locked, and every servant confined under watch. Rose stood pale, his hands trembling, unable to speak as the steward's guards took him by the arms. His spoon clattered to the stones. He said he had tasted it, He said he had eaten the same, but the eyes of the house had turned. A cook, a mere cook, had struck at the bishop's table. In an England aflame with tension and whispers of treachery, such an act could not go unanswered. And far off in Westminster, in the king's dark court, the news would arrive like a dagger's point. Poison, in a bishop's home. A crime not of hunger or passion, but of heresy perhaps, of treason. The pot had boiled, and now so too would the land. They came for him at dusk, when the sun had bled out behind the steeples of Southwark, and the Thames lay black as spilled ink. The torches of the guards hissed in the rain as they entered Lambeth, their mail clinking like chains in the gloom. No warrant was read, no questions asked, only the cold voice of the steward, the cook. Bind him. Richard Roose, now clad in nothing more than his coarse tunic and stained apron, was dragged from the kitchens like refuse from a feast. The kitchen boys stood frozen, pale as chalk, watching their master taken away. One muttered a prayer. Another turned and wept into his sleeve. He was taken to the bishop's hall, now still and silent as a tomb. A single body still lay beneath a winding sheet. Young Bennet, whose mother had sent him to serve God and learn Latin, not to choke on poisoned barley. Rose looked upon the corpse, his lips trembling. I served from the same pot, he whispered, though no one seemed to hear. A justice of the peace, summoned hastily from the city, took down statements by candlelight. Witnesses spoke of the stew, the sudden agony, the screams. The pot had not been left unattended. No outsider had entered the kitchen. The food had been tasted only by those within. All eyes circled back to Roose. "But I had no quarrel with the bishop," Roose pleaded, his voice cracking. "He was a good master. By the Holy Virgin, I meant no harm." The steward, a stern and scarred man who had served the bishop since the days of Henry VII, spat at his feet. "The devil takes many forms, cook, even one who stirs stew with a smile." By dawn, word had reached Westminster. The king's court was a serpent's nest of whispers, and poison was its favored metaphor. Treachery, sedition, heresy, all were spoken of with caution and dread. But when a real poison struck, at the table of a bishop loyal to Rome no less, the whispers turned to roars. King Henry was at Windsor when the news was brought to him. He sat in a velvet chamber with Anne Boleyn by his side, a hawk on his wrist and scripture on his tongue. But when the messenger delivered the scroll, the king rose in fury, casting aside the bird and calling for Cromwell and his council. "Poison," he said, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, "in the house of a servant of God? This is no murder, it is war." Some among the council urged restraint. Bishop Fisher was unharmed, and the killer, if killer he was, had been caught. But others, Cromwell among them, saw the deeper threat. Poison was not the weapon of men. It was the tool of devils, cowards, and heretics. "What if it had reached the bishop's mouth?" Cromwell asked darkly. "Or worse, what if such poison found its way to the king's cup?" Henry's expression turned ashen. The room fell silent. "Such evil must be met not with the lash," the king declared, "but with fire and steel. This Rose shall not be hanged. Number, his death must match his crime. Let the people see it. Let it burn into their minds. A man who boils broth for murder shall himself be boiled." Rose sat alone in the Tower of London, unaware of the storm his pot had stirred. He had confessed to nothing. He claimed innocence. But in the dark, with cold stone beneath him and the echo of chains in the corridor, doubt had crept into his soul like a rat beneath the door. Was he truly the cause? Had someone tampered with the food while his back was turned? Or was he, as he now feared, a pawn in a far greater game? No word came from his old master. No priest visited. The jailer brought crust and water, and the longer he sat in silence, the more the world outside sharpened its knives. For England was changing, and in times of change even a cook could become a weapon or a warning. In the days that followed, the tale of the poisoned pot ran through London like fire through dry thatch. Word flew faster than any courier, spoken from lips half truthful, half fearful, embroidered by gossip, stitched together in taverns and at market stalls. A bishop's boy dead. His whole table near slain. The cook confessed. It was for coin, they say, or revenge. No, he was paid by Luther's men to strike down Fisher. Men crossed themselves in the street. Women whispered behind shutters. For if a bishop could be struck at table, who then was safe? What protection did the nobility have, if even their stew might kill? The fear was not just of poison, but of something deeper, darker. The very soul of England seemed troubled. Old oaths were breaking. The Pope's voice grew distant. Bibles appeared in English, smuggled in barrels from Antwerp. Priests argued in hushed tones, some favoring Rome, others preaching the gospel of reform. And now murder by stew. The people of London, ever watchful for signs of God's wrath, saw in the boiling deaths a terrible omen. Priests called for fasts. Bakers offered bread in the shape of crosses. But all knew the kingdom had begun to tremble, and this cook, this Roose, was the crack in the wall. In the shadowed halls of Westminster, the king's mind grew darker still. Henry had long been a man torn between desire and conscience, between Rome and crown. But now he saw treason everywhere. Cromwell, ever at his shoulder, spoke softly of divine punishment, of bold justice, of the need for a new law. He is not merely a murderer, Cromwell said before the council. He is a traitor to the realm, for he struck not at a man, but at order itself. If a cook may kill with pot and ladle, what guards the king's cup? The king's fist struck the oak table. No rope shall be his end, Henry growled. Let England learn the weight of betrayal. So it was that the act for poisoning was born, not in the Commons nor the Lords, but in the fire of one man's fury. A law of singular cruelty, that any man who murdered by poison should suffer death not by hanging or the sword, but by being boiled alive. Boiled. The word chilled even the scribes who wrote it. Such a thing had not been seen in living memory. It was said in old chronicles that Saracens used it in the Mongols of the East. But not England, not a Christian land. And yet within the space of a fortnight, the act passed through Parliament. Few dared oppose it. To speak against it was to speak against the king and against justice itself, now bloodied and reborn. The date of execution was set. Back in the Tower, Rose heard of it only in fragments. A jailer muttered it over cards. A visiting priest looked away in sorrow and said nothing. Boiled? Rose asked, his voice weak. Like meat? No answer came. That night he lay on the cold stone floor, trembling. His thoughts drifted to his mother's cottage in Wiltshire, to summers in the fields, to his first apron tied by hands long buried. He wept, and in the dark the Tower seemed to sigh with him. London stirred. The cauldron was prepared at Smithfield. Great iron built large enough for a man to stand within. Pitch was added to the water. Chains were fixed to the handles. The place of burnings had seen much blood, but never this. Men said, "The king is watching now." And in the slums and manors alike, one name rang in every mouth, Richard Roose, the cook who would boil. The wind blew sharp across Smithfield, and the iron cauldron stood waiting like a beast from legend, deep-bellied, wide-mouthed, and cruel in its silence. Crafted by the king's smiths under orders none dared question, it sat atop a raised stone platform in the market square, ringed by wooden scaffolds and guarded by halberdiers in the Tudor red and gold. Its interior had been rubbed with pitch. Beneath it, a fire pit was dug and braced with green logs, ready for the flame. It was a cauldron not for broth, but for man. The people came before sunrise. They came from the taverns of Southwark, the butcheries of Cheapside, the river alleys of Wapping. Nobles arrived by carriage, pulling fine furs over their noses. Merchants pushed forward with their sons on their shoulders. Mothers clutched their children's hands, warning them to look and never forget. By mid-morning, thousands stood in the square, and at the very center, above them all, stood the high gallows scaffold, not with rope this day, but with iron and fire. The king himself did not attend, though his eyes were surely present, in the glint of his guards' helmets, in the whispers of his courtiers, in the very silence that blanketed the crowd as the condemned man was brought forth. Richard Roose. Gone was the cook's garb, the stains of grease and barley. He wore now only a thin white shirt, his legs bare beneath the chains. He stumbled as they led him up the wooden steps. His face was pale, nearly gray. His eyes, sunken and wide, moved like those of a hunted stag. A priest walked beside him, murmuring the final prayers in Latin, though Rose's lips barely moved. The crowd murmured. Some jeered. Others crossed themselves. "He poisoned God's own bishop! Burn him! Boil him! Lord have mercy!" The official stepped forward and read the sentence. His voice was slow, deliberate, and cruel. By the Act of Parliament, in the name of His Majesty King Henry VIII, it is decreed that Richard Roose, for the foul and unnatural crime of murder by poison, shall suffer death by being cast, alive, into boiling water, there to remain until life be departed. Roose gave no cry. His mouth opened, then closed. Then came the chains. 2 guards gripped his arms. Another fixed his wrists with iron shackles. A rope was thrown over the cross-beam of the scaffold, and slowly he was lifted. The crowd leaned forward as one. Below him the fire was lit. It began slow, a whisper, a hiss. Then came the roar. The water within the cauldron, already warm, began to tremble. Steam rose in ghostly spirals. The iron creaked. Roose turned his face to the sky. A bell rang from a nearby chapel, once, twice, and then the rope was loosed. The scream that followed was unlike anything the crowd had ever heard. It pierced flesh and bone. It silenced babes. It sent crows screaming from the rooftops. Roose thrashed within the boiling water, his limbs jerking, flesh blistering instantly. Some claimed he tried to speak. Others swore he cursed the king. But most said nothing. They could not look. The priest fell to his knees. A woman fainted. Even the guards turned away. It lasted longer than any hanging, longer than any burning. When at last the body stilled and the bubbling calmed, the fire was extinguished. The cauldron was closed, and Richard Roose, Cook of Lambeth, was no more. The people left silent. There was no cheer, no triumph, only the slow shuffle of feet on cobblestone and the smoke that lingered in the throat like poison itself. In the weeks that followed, the tale of Roose's boiling passed from mouth to mouth like plague. Children dreamed of cauldrons. Women prayed harder. Men watched their cups more carefully. And the king in his great hall said only this to his council: "Let no man say I do not value justice." But justice that day had taken on a new face. Not the blindfolded maiden of law, but a snarling mask of vengeance. England would not forget. The cauldron was cooled, the fire quenched, the scaffold torn down plank by plank. But in the hearts of Londoners, the boiling of Richard Roose simmered still. They spoke of it in alehouses, in whispers over market stalls, behind church doors. They spoke of it not as justice, but as omen. There was no celebration, no feasting, only the heaviness of a thing too monstrous to name. Even the Thames seemed darker. Mothers warned children, "Speak true, or the king shall boil you." Old men spat into the gutter and muttered that England had lost her soul. And in the colleges of Cambridge and the pulpits of Kent, a terrible question began to surface. Was this justice or wrath? The clergy murmured most of all. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, the target of the poisoned pot, had not asked for death. He had begged the king to spare the cook's life, a simple man, an ignorant man. But Henry had turned a deaf ear. Now the bishop grew quiet. His sermons grew colder, his prayers longer. He knew well what the boiling meant. It was not about poison, it was about power. In Westminster, the ink was still wet on the scrolls that bore the new law. The act for poisoning, passed with terrifying ease, had changed more than punishment. It had changed precedent. Until now, death by statute had been defined, confined, explained. Now the king had forged a new path, punishment by decree, by spectacle, by fear. A cook had been made an example, but examples breed silence or rebellion. Thomas More, still Lord Chancellor, grew wary. He had defended the law in Parliament, but in private he shuddered. "The law must serve the soul of the nation," he said quietly to a friend, "and not frighten it out of its body." But More was already losing favor. Cromwell was rising. It was Thomas Cromwell who saw the boiling not as horror, but as necessity. In Rose's fate, he saw the future. A country ruled not by Rome's old laws, nor by vague conscience, but by the king's will, sharp as a sword and swifter than judgment. He began to draft new orders, new commissions, new courts. If heretics could poison bishops, what else might they do? Spread Bibles in English? Question royal supremacy? Refuse the king's headship of the church? One cook had boiled, yes, but soon others might burn. Back in Lambeth, the kitchen where Rose once stirred pots stood empty. The hearth was cold. The wooden ladles hung untouched. The bishop's servants crossed themselves each time they passed the door, and the kitchen boys whispered stories of a ghost, of a pale man with blistered skin who came in the night stirring a pot that smoked with blood. Whether true or not, none returned to that hearth. A new cook was hired from Canterbury. He did not smile. The tale of Richard Roose began to spread beyond London, beyond Kent, north to Yorkshire, south to Winchester, west to the border towns. Some heard it with horror, others with quiet, dark satisfaction. In time, ballads were sung. He stirred the pot, and it stirred the crown. Now Rose lies scalded, boiled down. The king, he watches every flame, and justice bears no Christian name. They were outlawed, of course, but songs are stubborn things. In the cold silence of early Lent, one parchment lay in the scriptorium of Lambeth Palace. It bore no seal, only a line of ink, trembling at its edge, perhaps written by a clerk too shaken to steady his hand. Richard Roose, executed March 5th, 1531, boiled alive. No more was written, but the page, thin as it was, bore the weight of a kingdom in transformation. Spring came late that year. The buds on the trees of Lambeth were slow to open, as if the earth itself had turned cautious. Smoke still clung to the air like a bad memory, and though the sun rose earlier, its light felt pale, haunted. But in the halls of power, there was no pause, no mourning, only motion. Rose's boiling had not sated the king's hunger. It had awakened it. At court, whispers twisted like ivy. What had once been murmurs about the king's divorce now grew bold, for Henry was no longer content with quiet petitions to Rome. He had tasted the sharp edge of decree and found it good. If Parliament could boil a man on command, why could it not dissolve a marriage, or strip a pope's name from every pulpit in England? The Act in Restraint of Appeals was drafted, an edict that would sever the final line between Rome and the crown. No Englishman, not even bishop or cardinal, could seek justice from the Holy See. Justice would live and die in England now. And the man who had burned the bridge in blood and fire was none other than Thomas Cromwell. He carried the memory of Rose like a standard, whispering it in committee chambers, invoking it in letters to allies. "See what poisoners do," he said. "See what Rome breeds. Let the king's justice be swift, or the poison shall spread." Behind the scenes, Cromwell met with scholars and radical priests. He funded printers. He translated tracts. He quoted scripture like a sword, cleaving loyalty from the old order. And always at the center of his argument stood a cook, lowborn, nameless to the lords, but powerful in death. John Fisher grew quieter still. He had opposed the divorce. He had refused to recognize Anne Boleyn as queen. And now he watched as his survival, by luck or grace, from Rose's stew became a tool. They used his name to justify break and burn, to shout down the Pope, to forge a new church of blood and fear. One morning he knelt in the chapel of Rochester and whispered, "Deliver us not into temptation." But already Henry had marked him. If Fisher would not bend, he would break. The people too were changing. They no longer gathered in the square to watch executions with joy. They came with dread, with unease. The line between criminal and dissenter had blurred. One could be boiled for murder or burned for owning a Bible not blessed by Canterbury. In the alehouses, older men said, "It was better when the Pope ruled. At least you knew where you stood." But such words were dangerous. More than once, the Tower received new prisoners, whose only crime was to speak too freely of Rose, as if his name still boiled in their blood. And Henry, he grew heavier, darker, more certain. In council, his voice thundered, "God made me king, Not Rome. I am England's head. If I say what is truth, it is truth. If I call a traitor, let none beg pardon." He did not mention Rose again. He did not need to. The cook's death had served its purpose. It had become doctrine. One night in the quiet scriptorium of Lambeth, a young novice monk found a forgotten paper. It bore the list of those who had witnessed Rose's death. Some names were scribbled out, gone to exile, or perhaps the fire. He turned it over and saw a single line, scrawled in a different hand. He stirred the pot, and the kingdom boiled. He did not know who wrote it. He dared not ask, but he memorized the words. They came first for the printers, men who inked pages by candlelight, who dared to bind scriptures in English, who smuggled Tyndale's forbidden words beneath cloaks and into churches. Some were Flemish, some were sons of London. All were judged alike, heretics. In the spring of 1532, as the Thames thawed and the city breathed again, the fires began. At Smithfield, where Rose had boiled, now rose stakes of oak and ash. The crowd gathered once more, though not in the same numbers, nor with the same appetite. There was no spectacle now, only dread. The accused this time bore no poison in their hands. They carried only pages, words, translations. Some confessed, others stood silent as flame licked their feet. One cried out in Latin, quoting Paul, "Non enim erubesco evangelium Christi." "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." The people watched, confused. What gospel required such death? What king feared such words? Among them, Cromwell watched from a distance. To him, the fire was not punishment. It was purification. Every tongue that burned was one less to oppose the king's new church, one less to resist the statutes, the bishops, the English Bible yet to come. He began to speak of order, of uniformity, of obedience. If a cook could boil for poison, then surely a preacher could burn for blasphemy. He visited the presses, ordering license and oversight. He summoned clerics, demanding allegiance. He stood in Parliament and argued, "The king is not merely a man, he is ordained. His justice is not vengeance, it is divine." The fire sermons had begun. In the countryside, preachers adjusted their tone. No longer did they rail against vice or plead for charity. Now their voices sharpened with politics. Some praised the king's holy severance from Rome. Others held fast to the Pope's authority and were swiftly removed. Churches were emptied of saint statues, altars whitewashed, the Virgin's face scratched from stone. In some towns, people cheered. In others, they wept. A nation was being remade, and in its remaking, Rose's ghost remained, for the boiling had become legend. Some said his soul cried nightly from the Thames. Others said the king kept the cauldron as a trophy. No one dared repeat the cook's final words, if he had spoken them at all, but the tale grew in retelling. "He died not for poison," the whispers went. "He died for fear. The king feared Rome. The king feared God. And now he fears us." Such words were treason, but fear is not easily silenced. In Lambeth, Fisher prayed alone. The walls seemed thinner now. Spies walked the cloisters. The air had turned heavy, as if thick with the smoke of things not yet burned. He wrote in his journal, "If the soul is scalded by silence, is it not already dead?" But his letters were intercepted, his sermons censored, and soon he too would be summoned to answer for his loyalties. The bishop had survived poison. But could he survive truth? And what of Henry? The king stood taller now, crowned not only by gold but by certainty. His laws shaped doctrine, his signature, scripture. He looked into the mirror and saw not man but monarch, God's flame upon the earth. Behind him, the shadows grew long, and in those shadows the embers of Rose still glowed. By the summer of 1534, the law had teeth, not the teeth of wolves, but of something colder, crafted, forged, written in neat ink and sealed in wax. Parliament had passed the Act of Supremacy. The king was now head of the Church of England, a title no monarch had worn before. It was a crown of thorns, one he placed on his own brow with trembling hands. And those who refused to bow? They would bleed. In the Tower of London, Sir Thomas More awaited judgment. He no longer spoke of law. He no longer laughed in chambers or debated scripture with bishops. He prayed. He fasted. He watched the Thames drift by, slow and gray, like time itself. They had asked him to sign, just a name, a gesture, a surrender of conscience. He refused. When told that refusing the oath would mean death, he smiled faintly and said, "The king's good servant, but God's first." Bishop John Fisher shared the same stone silence. He had served England his whole life. He had survived Richard Roose's poison. He had preached against sin and called for mercy, even for the cook who nearly ended him. Now mercy was denied him. Like More, he refused the oath, not out of pride nor defiance, but out of something older, belief. The Pope, he claimed, was still the vicar of Christ. The king had no right to crown himself in the church's stead. For this, he would die. The scaffold awaited them both. When Fisher mounted the block, the headsman hesitated. The bishop was frail. His bones showed through his robes. But his voice, though hoarse, did not shake. He turned to the crowd and spoke not of kings or popes, but of the soul. The world passes. The word remains. The axe fell. The world turned. His head was placed on a spike over London Bridge, next to criminals, rebels, and now, saints. In the same week, Thomas More followed. He greeted his executioner with forgiveness, adjusted his collar, and laid his neck upon the block. His last words were quiet. "I die the king's faithful servant, but God's first." And so, the two voices who had dared to challenge Henry's church, born in flame and boiling, were silenced. But the silence echoed. Across England, a wind passed through the churches. Priests who once spoke Latin now preached in English. The Mass was altered, prayers rewritten, images smashed, shrines stripped, pilgrimages ended. The Holy Maid of Kent, Elizabeth Barton, who had once warned the king of divine judgment, was hanged at Tyburn, her prophecy choked by the rope. Monks were dragged from abbeys, forced to sign oaths or face ruin. Some submitted. Others vanished into forests or fled to Flanders. And yet, through it all, the memory of Richard Roose lingered. He had no sword, no pulpit, no page of scripture, only a pot and a death so cruel it burned itself into the soul of a nation. And though Fisher and More died with words of grace, it was Rose's boiling that had lit the path to their martyrdom. His execution had cracked open the door, and through it the king had marched with fire and law. Now Henry ruled alone atop his altar throne, but even he could not sleep as he once had, for the thorn crown he had taken was not made for peace. It pierced deeper each year. It left scars no surgeon could close. In dreams he heard voices, More's calm defiance, Fisher's blessing, and beneath them all, a bubbling sound, a cook's pot, a kingdom forever stirred. It began with whispers in Lincolnshire, then horns in Yorkshire, then fire. The year was 1536, and the land groaned. Fields lay unplowed. Monasteries, once the heart of every village, stood empty. The king's men had come with ledgers and seals, tearing down what centuries had built. They took relics, melted chalices, pulled saints from stone. Gold was stripped from altars. Livings were seized, nuns cast out. The sacred had become spoils, and the people wept. But not for long. In the market towns of the north, a banner was raised, the 5 wounds of Christ, bloodied and proud. Under it gathered thousands, farmers, priests, yeomen, knights. Men who had never drawn sword now marched with purpose. They called it the Pilgrimage of Grace, but it was no mere march. It was a reckoning. Their grievances were many. They called for the restoration of the monasteries, for the dismissal of Thomas Cromwell, for the punishment of heretical bishops. And, though his name was scarcely spoken aloud, they marched for the memory of men like John Fisher, like Thomas More, like the silent thousands whose only crime had been conscience. Among the whispered names was Richard Roose, a warning tale twisted into parable. "See what they did to the cook," said one old monk to the crowd at York. "A man may boil for rumor. How long until they boil you for prayer?" The words were dangerous, but they spread like fire in dry hay. In London, Henry's fury boiled over. He called the rebels serpents, traitors, spawn of the devil. But he feared them, for the North had risen not in ambition, but in faith. This was no mere rebellion. It was a crusade. It wore the trappings of religion and loyalty. But underneath it beat a heart of rage. The king sent promises, then armies, then executions. The rebellion was crushed, slowly and with treachery. Some leaders accepted pardons, others were tricked and taken. In the aftermath, the gallows of Yorkshire hung heavy. Over 200 men were hanged, including abbots, friars, and simple farmers. One priest was sewn into the skin of a horse and left to rot on the abbey gate. It was a harvest of bones. Back in London, Cromwell smiled thinly. The pilgrimage had failed, but the lesson had been learned. Never again would faith alone move the kingdom. He pressed Parliament further, dissolved more abbeys, strengthened the new church with laws tighter than iron. He gave the king what he wanted most, control. But even in triumph, something had changed. The king, once proud of his power, began to fear it. He trusted no one, not counselors, not wives, not even Cromwell. He took to walking the halls at night, muttering prayers no one taught him. Some said he was haunted, and perhaps he was. For all the executions, all the sermons, all the acts of Parliament could not silence the ghost of a simple cook, whose boiling had foretold it all. In a small chapel in the north, a monk lit a candle for the fallen rebels. He prayed for Fisher, for Moore, for the nameless. And as he dipped his hand in holy water, he murmured words not written in any missal. They boiled one man, and then the world burned. It is said the sun never sets on a crown too heavy, and by 1540 Henry Tudor's crown weighed like judgment. He had achieved all he sought, a church of his own making, wealth stripped from abbeys, enemies cast into dust. He had buried queens and married new ones. He had crushed rebellions and silenced bishops, but he had not found peace. In the halls of Whitehall, the king sat alone more often now. He no longer trusted the fire he had stoked. It had consumed more. It had claimed Fisher. It had devoured his once loyal subjects in the north. But the greatest blaze was yet to come. For even Thomas Cromwell, the architect of boiling laws, the master of reformation, now stood in the king's crosshairs. The charge was treason, or heresy, or arrogance. No one knew exactly, and it mattered little. Cromwell had overreached, arranging Henry's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, gathering power too quickly, speaking too freely. The king turned cold. The same Cromwell who had once pointed to Rose's pot as a symbol of divine justice now found his own name signed on a death warrant. On a summer morning, Cromwell was taken from council and dragged to Tower Hill. He begged, not for life, but for understanding. "I did all for your grace," he whispered, "and yet all is dust." The axe fell. The Reformation's iron architect was gone, and with him, the last man who remembered Richard Roose not as a warning, but as a beginning. The kingdom moved on, but uneasily. Henry aged. His leg festered. His moods darkened. He spoke often of betrayal, of wolves in priests' clothing, of wives who lied and men who plotted. He surrounded himself with flatterers and fools. At night, he dreamed of blood. Sometimes it was Fisher's head, sometimes Moore's eyes. But always at the center of the dream, a cauldron bubbled. In Smithfield, the site of Rose's death was paved over with market stalls. Fishmongers, cloth dealers, and hawkers shouted where once the cook screamed. But the stories remained. Children were told not to steal, or they'd end up boiled like the poisoner. Old wives muttered that rain on a Sunday was the cook's curse. A ghostly smell of stew haunted the alley behind the church. Rose, though long dead, had become part of the kingdom's folklore, as immortal as the king who had killed him. One chronicler wrote years later, "The cook who died in fire served not death, but prophecy. From his pot boiled the truth of England, that tyranny wears a crown as easily as a mitre, and justice often bleeds in silence." When Henry died in 1547, the bells tolled across the realm. He was buried in Windsor beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who bore him a son. But no monument was built to the men who died for his supremacy. Not Rose, not Fisher, not Cromwell, not the nameless. Only one memorial endured: the law. The act for poisoning remained on the books for years after. A scar in ink, a reminder, a threat. And so ends the tale of Richard Roose, not merely as a cook, not merely as a scapegoat, but as a keystone in the cathedral of tyranny. He stirred a pot, and a kingdom boiled.